Good afternoon, class. Today we are going to be talking about human reflex anatomy. So this is our special senses lab, and today our focus is going to be on reflexes. Next week we'll be focusing on the eye, but this week we're going to be focusing on reflexes. So essentially, a reflex is a rapid, predictable, and involuntary response to a stimulus. Okay, it occurs over pathways called reflex arcs, and reflex arcs are going to be the direct route from a sensory neuron to an interneuron to an effector. And essentially, we're going to talk about this in more detail in the diagram. But so remember, you get a stimulus that's going to be transmitted from a sensory neuron, which is going to be, could be in your skin, wherever. It's going to travel what's called afferent with an Afferent. That's going to travel inferent to the central nervous system. Okay. And then in the central nervous system, it could be the spinal cord, could be the cranial nerves, usually spinal cord or cranial nerves, depending on what part of the body you're dealing with. It could go to an interneuron, where essentially the sensory neuron is going to synapse with the motor neuron, and then the motor neuron is the effector, and it's going to travel in the efferent, Efferent pathway. All right, and effector, efferent, those two go together. All right, and we're going to talk about this more in the diagram on the next page, but be aware that reflexes usually fall into two categories, either autonomic, and remember when we talk about anything autonomic, it's involuntary, but usually we're dealing with smooth muscles, and we're dealing with the digestive system, things of that nature. So those deals with autonomic reflexes, also blood pressure, salivation, things of that nature, sweating, all those things are autonomic, and it usually goes through smooth muscle pathway, whereas the somatic reflexes, okay, that's going to involve stimulation of skeletal muscles, and it's going to be directed by the somatic division of the nervous system. All right, and the things that we would test, we will. I mean, unfortunately, we're not going to be in lab, but you can still do it at home, as many as you can. But the reflexes we would normally test in the lab setting would be the somatic reflexes. And also just understand that, why is this important? Essentially, a lot of times if there's some kind of damage in the central nervous system, whether it's spinal cord, brain stem, cranial nerves, wherever you think there's some kind of damage, you can test certain reflexes in certain locations that travel to certain parts of the central nervous system. And if the reflex doesn't work in that area, then you can kind of narrow down where the damage has occurred. And of course, you would use imaging technology and other stuff to give you a better picture. But just checking the reflexes can tell you a lot as far as any kind of damage in the spinal cord or cranial nerves. All right, so there are essentially 5 basic components of a reflex arc. Okay, so we're going to talk about each one. First, you have a receptor in the site of stimulus action. So essentially, this receptor, in this case, it's in the skin. It's going to sense a stimulus, and then it's going to travel afferent. So this is going toward the central nervous system. This is the afferent pathway, all right, to the central nervous system, all right, and it's going to travel through a sensory neuron, okay, and this is number 2. This is a sensory neuron that's transmitting the impulse to the central nervous system, okay. In this case, it's going to the spinal cord. All right, so once that sensory neuron reaches the spinal cord, it's going to go to step number 3, which is the integration center. So this integration center, it could be a simple single synapse between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. Okay, if it's just a simple single synapse between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron, that is called a monosynaptic reflex. But in this case, you see this right here, that is an interneuron. So if you have an interneuron in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, if you have this interneuron in between, that's going to be a polysynaptic reflex, and it's going to involve one or more interneurons synapsing to form the integration center. And you may ask, well, in this case, all you're doing is you're going from the sensory neuron to an interneuron to the motor neuron. So you might say, what's the point of the interneuron? And sometimes you will have you will want to activate a muscle and then inhibit a different muscle. So when you have these interneurons and these different connections, it allows you to do more than one thing, essentially. Sometimes you want to cause the one muscle to contract, and then you need another muscle to relax, a different muscle to relax. So that's where those interneurons and different connections come in handy. In this case, this is really a pretty straightforward one. You have the sensory neuron connecting to the interneuron, which is sending the signal, transmitting the signal to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron is the efferent, EFFERENT, efferent pathway. And it's going to end at the neuromuscular junction, and we talked all about that. And it's going to cause, in this case, the effector muscle to contract. As I previously stated, you can have somatic reflexes and autonomic reflexes. And somatic reflexes are going to stimulate skeletal muscles. So since you, for instance, you touch something hot, all right, and you're automatically, your hand jerks away from the hot object. Autonomic reflexes are going to involve smooth muscle, the heart and glands, and essentially autonomic reflexes you don't regulate. So they regulate smooth muscle, they regulate the heart and blood pressure, glands and digestive system. So remember autonomic smooth muscle you really don't regulate. And all reflexes are involuntary, but with smooth muscles you don't regulate at any point. With skeletal muscles, there is voluntary control when you want to move your arm, but the reflexes are involuntary because they're a reflex, but still. So, all right, so this is just written what we already talked about in the diagram. So again, you have your sensory receptor, could be in the skin, wherever. A stimulus, something you hit something in your skin, you prick yourself, you burn yourself, whatever, sends a signal. Um, the signal is going to be traveled through the efferent pathway, essentially to the central nervous system, usually the spinal cord or cranial nerves, depending on what part of the body it is. And then it's going to either connect synapse with a motor neuron, or it's going to synapse with an interneuron, and then an interneuron is going to synapse with the motor neuron. So it just depends. And then and that's the integration center. So then from that integration center to the motor neuron, it's going to go down to the effector organ, and again, that's the efferent, EFFERENT pathway. And then the effector organ, the muscle or gland, is going to be stimulated. All right, one of the most common reflex that everyone likes to do is the patellar reflex. And here's the diagram of it, so it's easier to talk about it at the diagram. All right, this patellar reflex is a specific example of a stretch reflex. So essentially, stretch reflexes are initiated by tapping a tendon. So right here, you're gonna tap the patella tendon or ligament, which stretches the muscle to which the tendon is attached. Okay, so after you tap this tendon, it's gonna cause this muscle to which the tendon is attached to stretch. So again, you tap the patella tendon, it causes the muscle that is attached to the quadricep muscle to stretch, and essentially that stretching is going to send the that's going to be the sensory receptor going to send a signal, um, the afferent pathway right here to the central nervous system, to the spinal cord. Okay, and in the spinal cord, you're going to do the you're going to form the integration center. And essentially, on this diagram, it's kind of the simplified diagram. They have the sensory neuron synapsing with the motor neuron, and then the motor neuron is going to cause the quadriceps to um, contract. But you actually have an additional step, which they have it in your lab manual. You have an interneuron right here. Okay, so you have this does connect this motor neuron. I'm sorry, it does connect with the sensory neuron. Okay, but this sensory neuron will also connect with an interneuron. So you have kind of two branches. One branch here, another branch in here of this sensory neuron, and this branch of the sensory neuron will branch with an interneuron, and then the interneuron will send an inhibitory signal to the antagonist muscle, which are the hamstrings, and keep them from contracting and allow the quadriceps to contract. Okay, and then you get the kick that you get. So these contract and these get inhibited. All right, and you will have an interneuron that will synapse with this sensory neuron, and then it will send an inhibitory. Another pathway right here will be the inhibitory pathway to the hamstring muscles, inhibiting them from contracting, allowing only the quadriceps to contract. Okay, but this is the simplified version. This just has the sensory neuron synapsing with the motor neuron, and it shows you the effector organ. The motor neuron is going to end at the neuromuscular junction, and the effector organ, the quadriceps, is going to contract. Okay, it's just showing you the simplified version. It's not showing you the additional pathway, and that's fine.